Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
On October 16, 1962, a U.S. spy plane found evidence of Soviet nuclear missiles and launch pads on Cuban soil. At the height of the Cold War, the Kennedy administration ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, initiating a 13-day standoff between the superpowers, bringing the world close to nuclear annihilation.
The prevailing view states that this tragic event was overcome by the triumph of diplomacy. Documents declassified 30 years after the crisis, however, paint a different picture. Rather than the genius work of statesmanship by the Kennedy administration, it appears that our survival is largely the result of good fortune in the face of contradictory, narrow-minded, and often incompetent advice from many of the president's senior advisors.
Viewing the missile crisis with a clear lens, we hope to learn about the successes and failures of diplomacy and structure better policy in our increasingly nuclearized world. There were five major failures of the Kennedy administration in dealing with the crisis. The first, and possibly the most egregious, was a complete failure to understand the enemy. They couldn't grasp the concept that any people could ever support a communist government. The US thought that all they had to do was depose Fidel Castro and the Cubans would be free. Cuba's communist dictator actually enjoyed widespread support. Things were even worse with the USSR. Owing to his experience in Berlin, Kennedy saw them as an evil empire trying to take over the world, with Premier Nikita Khrushchev being its aggressive, immoral ruler. In his address to the nation, Kennedy says, "I call upon him, Khrushchev, to abandon this course of world domination." We now know that Khrushchev harbored no such ambitions. He was deeply concerned with the US stationing missiles in Turkey, and he felt that placing missiles in Cuba would help even the playing field. He also wanted to short-circuit the rising influence of China in the communist world. The second is a failure to detect the missiles stationed in Cuba for months. Castro pleaded for conventional assistance in the Kremlin after a failed US invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev surprised his advisors by deciding to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, saying, "Why not throw a hedgehog at Uncle Sam's pants?" Over 5 months, top-secret Operation Anadr ran its course. Thousands of pieces of equipment and tens of thousands of men were sent 8,000 miles away on 200 shipments. The CIA also had over 200 human intelligence reports about Soviet missiles in Cuba, one of which was from a Republican senator from New York, Kenneth Keating. Keating told CIA Director John McCone that he had it on good authority that there were 6 operational Soviet missile bases in Cuba as of August 31st. McCone dismissed it as partisan troublemaking. On September 19th, in an almost perfect example of intelligence failure, the CIA issued the Special National Intelligence Estimate, in which they determined that there were no missiles in Cuba and the Soviets were highly unlikely to attempt such a deployment. In light of this, the military scaled back aerial surveillance of Cuba. In fact, the overflight of October 16th, which photographed the missile sites, was the first such operation in 5 weeks. The third failure was a failure to form a comprehensive or coherent plan to deal with the crisis, a glaring failure in the middle of a Cold War. The intelligence service was mostly focused on assassinating or overthrowing Castro, the military wanted to attack Cuba, and Kennedy remained apprehensive about engaging the Soviets because he feared they would retaliate against Berlin. The infighting between Kennedy and some of his advisors was both unproductive and embarrassing.
reprisal would be. I don't think they're going to make any reprisal. If we tell them that the Korean situation is just like it's always been, if they make a move, we're going to fight. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this, and I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix, President Donald. You're in a pretty bad fix. You're in a fix.
Somebody can keep them from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal. That's our problem. Go in and frig around with a missile, you're screwed. You go in and frig around with a little else, you're screwed. That's right. You're screwed. And if some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit frigging around. That was my don't.
According to Robert Kennedy, the president was very distrustful of his generals after they bungled the Bay of Pigs invasion. Had he not been so skeptical, the crisis may have turned out very differently. Further complicating matters, there was a complete failure to communicate on both sides. After World War II, the US and Soviet Union were in adversarial positions, with the US and its allies securing Western Europe and Eastern Europe squarely under the command of the USSR. There was a total breakdown in diplomatic relations, leaving no good options for the countries to communicate in the most trying of times. In one famous story of the crisis, a Russian submarine nearly fired its nuclear armaments because they thought they were being attacked after the US Navy dropped a depth charge, signaling them to come up. Kennedy used his televised address to the nation and stories published in the New York Times and other major newspapers to convey his message to the Soviets. This was a rather ineffective method. Near the end of the crisis, Khrushchev sent 2 letters to Kennedy, the first outlining his demands, and the second laying out his proposal to withdraw the missiles. These letters arrived in the wrong order, however, which led the Kennedy administration to fear he had been overthrown or was going back on his word. The only truly effective communication in the missile crisis was between Robert Kennedy and Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, who met face-to-face at the end of the crisis. The fifth failure, which was possibly the most tragic, was the Kennedy administration's failure to learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, there were positive outcomes. The so-called Red Phone, which was a direct line of communication from the White House to the Kremlin, was installed. The crisis also set some ground rules for the conduct of the superpowers going forward. Yet the Kennedy administration failed to appreciate their own shortcomings. The US took the withdrawal of Soviet missiles as a victory and a symbol of their moral superiority. Arthur Schlesinger, one of the president's advisors, laid all of the blame at the feet of the Soviet Union and assured Kennedy that the US's moral superiority had won the day.
Despite all these failures, we're still here, trying to learn how to better deal with a global nuclear crisis. Only with the passing of time do we realize that history is not two-dimensional. It has a depth and complexity which we failed to appreciate during much of the Cold War. Through the lens of the Kennedy administration, everything the Soviets did was evil, aggressive, and self-serving. Similar views did exist on the other side. We study failures in the hope of learning from the past and being better prepared to face the challenges of the future, to turn tragedy into triumph next time.